Mark has been contributing to his 401k, that's his employer retirement account, for 11 years. Never missed a month. Maxes it out every year. Reads the statements when they arrive. And still, when he does the math, something doesn't add up. He's saving correctly. The account is growing. But the gap between where he is and where he needs to be doesn't seem to be closing the way it should. He's not alone. According to Federal Reserve data, the median American between the ages of 55 and 64 has $185,000 saved. That's the person on the doorstep of retirement. Meanwhile, surveys published in 2026 show Americans believe they need $1.46 million to retire comfortably. That gap isn't bad luck. It isn't a discipline problem. It's a math problem, and the math works differently than most people were told. Here's the part that doesn't get explained. Compounding doesn't grow steadily. It grows in jumps. There are 3 specific dollar amounts where the curve permanently shifts, where the portfolio stops depending on you and starts pulling itself forward. Miss those thresholds, or stall just below them, and you keep doing all the right things while the finish line stays exactly as far away. That's what this video is about. My name is Alex, and if you've ever looked at your retirement balance and felt like your contributions aren't moving the needle the way they should, stay with this, because the issue almost certainly isn't how much you're saving. And I'm going to show you exactly where the compounding math breaks in your favor and what's silently dragging your momentum backward before you ever get there. Once you understand where you sit on this curve, you won't just feel better about your balance. You'll know which number to hit next and why hitting it changes everything that follows. Most people never cross those thresholds, not because they save too little, but because they're operating inside the wrong mental model entirely. And that model has a name. It's called the retirement math trap. Here's the thing nobody puts in the brochure. The system you were handed to build your retirement was designed around a fundamentally incorrect assumption, not maliciously, not as a conspiracy, just as a simplification that became so widely repeated, it started to feel like physics. The assumption is this: saving money is a linear process. You put money in, the account grows, you retire. The bucket fills at roughly the same rate every year, and if you just stay consistent long enough, you eventually get there. Your HR department built your onboarding materials around this idea. Your financial advisor's projection charts assume it. Every retirement calculator you have ever used draws a smooth, straight line from where you are today to where you need to be. The problem is that the line is not straight. It never was. Think about how most people actually reason about their retirement. They look at their balance, they look at their goal, and they do the arithmetic. Someone with $100,000 saved and a target of $1.46 million does the subtraction, $1,360,000 to go. They divide that by their annual contribution. If they are putting in $20,000 a year, that is 68 more years of saving. The math is technically correct. The framework is completely wrong. That calculation treats compounding like addition, but compounding is multiplication. And multiplication, at scale, behaves in a way that genuinely surprises people the first time they see it clearly. Here's a better picture. Imagine rolling a snowball across a flat field. In the early years, you are doing all the work yourself. You push it forward, it picks up a little snow, it gets slightly heavier, slightly larger, but the effort still feels disproportionate to the result. You are contributing more than the snowball is generating on its own. That is where most people spend most of their saving life, in the flat, effortful early stage, wondering why the account balance does not seem to reflect the discipline they are putting in. Now imagine the field has a hill, not a gradual slope, a specific point where the ground drops away. Once the snowball reaches a certain size and hits that point, something changes. Gravity takes over. The snowball starts pulling itself forward. It gathers mass faster than you could ever push it. The effort that felt thankless for years suddenly produces results that feel almost unfair in the other direction. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of how compound interest actually behaves at specific portfolio sizes. The curve does not rise smoothly. It rises slowly, then suddenly, and the transition between those two states happens at exact dollar amounts, not vague milestones. Now here is the part worth sitting with for a moment. Consider James, a 39-year-old project manager in Denver. James has been contributing to his 401k for 12 years. Currently, the average 401k contribution rate sits at around 7.4% of salary. At James's income, that works out to roughly $19,000 a year going in. His balance is at $142,000 and growing. By any external measure, James is doing well. Better than most, actually. But James still feels behind. Not dramatically behind, just persistently, quietly behind. Like he is running at the right pace, but the finish line is not getting closer at the rate it should. That feeling is real, and it has an explanation. James is still on flat ground. His portfolio is growing, but it is growing because he is pushing it. His contributions are doing more work than his returns are. The snowball is not yet large enough to roll on its own. He is in the early, effortful stage of the curve. And without knowing where the hill starts, he has no way of knowing how close he actually is to the moment everything changes. That moment is not some abstract future event. It happens at a precise number. And understanding where that number sits, and why crossing it permanently changes the relationship between your effort and your outcome, is exactly what makes the difference between a retirement that requires decades of grinding and one that starts pulling itself forward. The first place the physics change is closer than most people expect. And it comes with a number that reframes everything you thought you understood about what your money's actually doing while you sleep. That number is the first major math shift. And it lands at exactly $100,000. $100,000. It sounds like a round number someone picked for convenience, but it is not arbitrary. It is the exact point where the relationship between your effort and your portfolio's output permanently changes for the first time. And once you see why, you cannot unsee it. Here's what happens at that number. A $100,000 portfolio earning 10% annually, which lines up with the S&P 500's historical average return over any 30-year window, generates $10,000 in passive returns over the course of a year. $10,000 that required no labor, no commute, no performance review, no negotiation with a manager about whether you deserve it. It simply arrived because the money was there and the market did what markets do over time. Now compare that to what the average American actually contributes to their 401k through their own effort in a year. Currently, that figure sits at around $9,080, which means at exactly $100,000 saved, your portfolio's passive annual output just crossed above the average person's entire yearly contribution. Your money is now working harder than the average American saver. Not eventually, right now, at that specific balance. Take a second to actually feel what that means. You still have a job, you still show up, you are still doing all the things you were doing before. But something quietly shifted. There is now a second version of you running in the background, one that never calls in sick, never asks for a raise, never needs a vacation, and that version just became more productive than most people's entire annual saving effort. That is not motivational language. That is just the arithmetic. Most people blow past this milestone without noticing it. They check the balance, see it cross six figures, feel a brief moment of satisfaction, and move on. What they miss is that the nature of their portfolio just changed. Before $100,000, you are the primary engine. After it, the portfolio starts contributing meaningfully to its own growth. Not enough to coast, not enough to stop, but enough that the dynamic is genuinely different. This is where someone like Teresa comes in. Teresa is a 41-year-old logistics coordinator in Columbus. She's been disciplined her entire adult life. Brown bag lunches, no car payment, automatic transfers the day after every paycheck. Her balance recently crossed $106,000, and she felt, if she's being honest, a little disappointed. She expected it to feel like more. The account just kept growing at roughly the same pace it always had. Nothing dramatic happened. What Teresa does not yet realize is that her portfolio is now generating just over $10,600 a year entirely on its own. That is a meaningful second income quietly compounding in the background. The reason it does not feel dramatic is that compounding does not announce itself. It just runs. And right now, it is running in Teresa's favor, whether she notices it or not. But here is where the honest part of this conversation matters. Crossing $100,000 is significant. It is also fragile. This is the stage where a lot of people ease off, not because they are lazy, but because the progress finally feels real enough to justify a small reward. A nicer apartment, a newer car, a long overdue vacation, and individually, none of those decisions is wrong. Collectively, they can slow the snowball right before the hill gets steep enough to matter. Because the next threshold is not just another milestone, it is the one where the math does something that genuinely has no equivalent in ordinary savings logic. It is the point where your portfolio's annual return crosses above the maximum amount the government legally allows you to contribute to a 401k in a single year. After that line, the market is doing more for your retirement than the law permits you to do yourself. That threshold has a name in this framework. It is the most critical number on any retirement calculator, and almost nobody talks about it. It sits at $250,000. And what happens there is where the real story begins. That is threshold 2, and it comes with something nobody expects. A valley you have to survive first. Nobody warns you about the valley. That is the part that gets left out of every retirement planning conversation. You cross $100,000, you feel the momentum starting to build, and then life does what life always does. It gets expensive, and the snowball that was finally starting to roll on its own hits a patch of flat ground again, right before the most important threshold in this entire framework. That stretch between $100,000 and $250,000 has a name: the Valley of Despair. Not because the math stops working, it does not, but because the growth still feels slow relative to the effort. The temptation to redirect money toward other things is at its highest exactly when staying the course matters most. Think about what typically happens in this life stage. A car lease expires and gets replaced with something nicer. A first or second child arrives with costs that are impossible to fully anticipate. A promotion comes through, which sounds like good news, and it is. But promotions have a way of expanding lifestyle at the same rate as income. Currently, consumer spending data shows that households earning between $80,000 and $120,000 a year spend roughly 93 cents of every additional dollar they earn. The savings rate barely moves even as income climbs. The snowball keeps growing, but slower than it should, and the window to hit the next threshold quietly stretches longer than it needed to. Here is why getting through that valley matters so much. $250,000 is not just another number on a chart. At 10% annual return, a $250,000 portfolio generates $25,000 passively in a single year. And this year, the maximum legal contribution limit for a 401k is $24,500. Read that again. Your portfolio's passive annual return just exceeded the absolute maximum the government allows you to contribute to a retirement account through your own labor. The market does not have a contribution ceiling. The law does. And at $250,000, the market steps quietly over that ceiling every single year. That is not a minor technical detail. That is a structural shift in how your retirement gets built. Before this threshold, you are the dominant force. After it, the portfolio takes the lead. You are still contributing, but you are no longer the most important variable in the equation. Now consider Marcus. Marcus is a 44-year-old operations manager in Phoenix. He's been doing everything the right way for years, maxing his 401k, holding low-cost index funds, ignoring the noise when markets get choppy. His balance sits at $189,000. By any reasonable measure, Marcus is ahead of most Americans his age. The median retirement savings for someone in his bracket currently sits well below that. But Marcus carries a low-grade financial anxiety he cannot quite explain. He earns well. He saves consistently. And yet the finish line does not feel closer. Here is the explanation he has not been given. At $189,000, his portfolio is generating roughly $18,900 a year passively. He is contributing $24,500. He is still outworking his own money, still pushing the snowball, still the primary engine of his own retirement. The market is helping, but Marcus is doing the heavy lifting. Now run the numbers forward. If Marcus trims his lifestyle creep and redirects an additional $7,000 a year into his investments for 3 years, he will cross $250,000. At that exact moment, the portfolio takes over the lead. His passive returns exceed what the law allows him to contribute. For the first time in his savings life, the market is officially doing more for his retirement than he is. The hill appears. The snowball accelerates. The effort that felt thankless for years starts paying out in a way that finally matches the discipline it took to get there. Most people, and this is the part that genuinely frustrates me, spend the bulk of their working life somewhere between $180,000 and $250,000. without ever realizing how close they were to the line where everything changes. A few targeted decisions separate years of grinding from the moment gravity finally takes over. But crossing $250,000 is not the final destination. It is the launch pad. Because once the market takes the lead, there's a third threshold waiting further up the hill, one where the numbers stop being about beating a contribution limit and start being about something far more significant. That threshold is called true independence. And what happens at $580,000 is in a different category entirely. There is a number that most retirement conversations never actually name. They talk about having enough. They talk about replacing your income. They use phrases like financial independence without ever attaching a specific dollar figure to them. So here is the figure, $580,000. That is the exact point where your portfolio's annual output equals what a full-time job pays the average American worker. Not approximately, not in the right ballpark. Mathematically equivalent, and what that equivalence means for how you think about your own working life is worth sitting with for a moment. Here is the mechanism. A $580,000 portfolio earning 10% annually generates $58,000. The Bureau of Labor Statistics currently reports the median full-time salary for workers aged 25 to 34 at $57,564. Those two numbers are now occupying the same space. Your capital is producing what a human being produces by showing up to work every day for a full year. Except your capital does not commute. It does not burn out. It does not have a difficult quarter or get passed over for promotion. It just runs. Now, to be clear about what this does and does not mean, hitting $580,000 does not require you to quit your job. It does not mean you are done. It means something more valuable than either of those things. It means the relationship between your labor and your financial future has permanently inverted. Before this point, you worked to fund the portfolio. After it, the portfolio could fund you. That shift from dependency to optionality is the actual product of compounding, not a number on a screen, a choice you now have that you did not have before. Think about what that choice actually feels like in practice. Consider Nina, a 47-year-old marketing director in Atlanta. Nina has spent 2 decades building a career she is proud of but no longer loves. The work is fine, the salary is good, but she stays largely because the math requires it. The mortgage, the kids' school costs, the life she and her husband built, it all depends on her showing up. She does not feel trapped exactly. She just does not feel free. At $580,000 in her portfolio, something changes that has nothing to do with whether she actually quits. The calculation shifts. She could restructure. She could negotiate. She could take a role that pays 30% less and still have the portfolio covering the gap. The career decisions she makes after crossing this threshold are no longer purely driven by financial necessity. That is not a small thing. For most people, financial pressure is the invisible hand behind nearly every major life decision they make for 30 years. This threshold is where that hand starts to loosen its grip. But here is the part that does not get said enough. The stretch between $250,000 and $580,000 is where the most damaging and avoidable mistakes tend to happen. The portfolio is growing meaningfully now. It feels more real. And that reality, paradoxically, is what makes people vulnerable. Sequence of returns risk is the first one worth naming. A significant market downturn in this window does disproportionate damage compared to earlier stages, simply because the absolute dollar amounts at stake are larger. A 20% drop at $50,000 costs $10,000. The same percentage drop at $400,000 costs $80,000. Same market, same percentage, very different outcome. The math of recovery is also harder. Losing 30% requires a 43% gain just to get back to even. The second mistake is over-allocating to cash out of anxiety. The portfolio feels large enough to protect now, and some people respond by moving a significant portion to savings accounts or money market funds. Currently, even the most competitive high-yield savings accounts are paying well below long-term equity returns. Sitting in cash at this stage does not feel like a mistake. It feels prudent. That feeling is expensive. The final climb from $250,000 to $580,000 is not more difficult than what came before. The snowball is bigger. The hill is steeper. Gravity is working harder in your favor than at any previous point. What derails people here is not the market. It is the decisions they make in response to how the market feels in any given year. Stay the course through that window, avoid the traps, and the snowball does something remarkable on the other side. But getting there faster than the standard timeline suggests is entirely possible. And it comes down to a few specific moves that most people overlook. That is what accelerating your snowball is actually about. Most people assume the fastest way to reach these thresholds is to earn more, get the promotion, pick up a side income, find a higher paying role. And look, none of that is wrong, but it is not the most leveraged move available to someone who is already saving consistently. The most leveraged move is almost always the one hiding inside the account itself, quietly taxing the compounding every single year without ever sending an invoice. Start with the timeline question, because it reframes everything. The standard path to $580,000, assuming consistent contributions and average market returns, lands most people somewhere around their mid-60s. That is not a failure, but it is also not the only version of events available. The geometry of compounding rewards acceleration disproportionately at the earlier thresholds, meaning that small targeted changes made between $100,000 and $250,000 produce outsized results further up the curve. The decisions made in the Valley of Despair determine not just whether you cross threshold 2, but how old you are when you cross threshold 3. Here is how that plays out in practice. Consider Daniel, a 40-year-old civil engineer in Portland. He recently crossed the threshold of 1. His balance sits at $114,000. He is contributing steadily, holding index funds, doing the right things. On the standard path, Daniel hits $250,000 at 47 and $580,000 at 57. Solid outcome. Reasonable timeline. Now Daniel makes 4 changes. He cuts an unused gym membership and 2 subscription services he forgot he was paying for, freeing up just over $3,000 a year. He pays off a personal loan carrying a 4% interest rate, which redirects another $4,000 annually back into his investment account. He increases his total investing rate by $9,000 per year combined, and he audits his fund holdings and moves everything into low-cost index funds, cutting his average expense ratio from 1.1% down to 0.06%. The result is not marginal. Daniel hits threshold 2 at 44 instead of 47. He crossed $580,000 at 52 instead of 57. By the time he reaches 57, the age he would have hit threshold 3 on the standard path, his balance is $260,000 higher than it would have been. Same market, same income, completely different outcome. The fee piece of this deserves its own moment, because most people dramatically underestimate what it costs them. Here is the math, and it is worth walking through slowly. Take a $1 million portfolio growing at 7% annually over 30 years, with a 0.25% fee, which is roughly what a good index fund charges. That portfolio grows to approximately $7 million. Now take the exact same portfolio, the exact same return, and raise the fee to 1%. That portfolio grows to approximately $5.7 million. The difference is $1.3 million, from a fee most people never read carefully enough to notice. Here is the mechanism that makes that number so large. You're not losing 1% of your balance each year. You're losing 1% of your balance, plus all the compounding that 1% would have generated over the remaining decades. The fee does not just take money. It takes the money that money would have made every single year for 30 years. That is not a cost. It is a compounding drag, and it hits hardest in the exact window where compounding is starting to accelerate. Currently, the average actively managed mutual fund charges somewhere between 0.5 and 1.2% annually. The average index fund charges around 0.06%. That gap is not about investment philosophy. It is not about whether active managers are smarter. It is about arithmetic. A managed fund has to outperform an index fund by its full fee differential just to break even on returns. Most do not. The data on this is not ambiguous. The practical implication is simple. You do not need to earn more, predict the market, or find a smarter strategy. You need to stop paying a tax on your own acceleration, especially in the years between threshold 1 and threshold 2, where every percentage point of drag costs you not months, but years of momentum, which brings everything in this video to a single point of clarity. And that is where the conclusion begins. Here's what this video is actually about. Not thresholds, not percentages, no contribution limits. It was about the gap between how saving feels and how saving actually works. The math of compounding does not reward consistency evenly. It rewards it in jumps at $100,000, at $250,000, at $580,000. Below those lines, you are the engine. Above them, the portfolio takes over. That is the mechanism most people were never shown. 3 things worth carrying forward. First, your progress is not linear, so do not measure it that way. Second, the government caps what you can contribute. The market does not. At $250,000, the market quietly steps over that cap on your behalf. Third, fees do not cost you money. They cost you compounding. That distinction is worth more than any stock pick. Take 5 minutes this week. Open the account. Multiply the balance by 0.1. That number is what your money earned last year without you. Compare it to what you contributed. The gap between those 2 figures tells you exactly where you sit on the hill. There is one question this video did not answer. Once the portfolio fully replaces your labor income, once crossing $580,000 becomes a matter of when rather than if. How do you structure the withdrawal side without dismantling the compounding that got you there? That is a different problem entirely, and it is worth understanding before you need the answer. If this reframed something for you, share it with someone still pushing the snowball on flat ground. They are probably closer to the hill than they think.